Hi. Welcome to today's Rotman lecture. It's a real pleasure today to introduce my friend Dr. Şerife Tekin. Dr. Tekin is an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Texas at San Antonio. She works primarily in the areas of philosophy of science, medicine, and psychiatry, the philosophy of mind and cognitive science, and bioethics. She has published numerous articles in these research areas, and her work has appeared in top journals, including Synthèse, the American Journal of Bioethics Neuroscience, Philosophy, Psychiatry, and Psychology, and Philosophical Psychology, to name only a handful. She is the co-editor of two books that have come out in the past couple of years. In fact, one coming out just this year. The Bloomsbury Companion to Philosophy of Psychiatry, which she co-edited with Robin Bloom, that came out this year, and Extraordinary Science and Psychiatry, Responses to the Crisis in Mental Health Research, which she co-edited with Jeff Poland and was published by MIT Press in 2017. And I encourage you to buy both of those books. Today she'll be talking to us about the indispensability of patient testimonies for objectivity in psychiatry. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Tekin.
Thank you for so much for coming to my talk and actually for hosting me at Western. It's been a really lovely week so far, and I've been really enjoying getting to know you. And I want to kind of send like a special love to Jackie, who I met actually after I finished my dissertation at York in Toronto, and during a postdoc when she was commenting on one of my papers, and she ended up commenting on a number of my papers, which I benefited highly from. So I can't really thank her enough for that like early mentoring and support that she gave to my research program. So so this project is kind of new, kind of not in a way. So I'm currently working on a book, and a lot of the arguments that I make this book making the book kind of got me into thinking about like the epistemological problems in psychiatry and psychiatric research. So I kind of turned and found myself writing this particular paper. I don't know if this will end up in the book or this is a second book project, so it remains to be seen, but I'm really looking forward to feedback and comments because it's a, fairly new kind of set of ideas using some of my old ideas. So just to kind of start with, so this is, I don't know if you've been to Buffalo. It's not too far from here. And if you are interested in mental illness and old buildings and history of mental illness, Richardson Complex in Buffalo, New York is a great place to visit, which is now turned into a hotel, which is kind of, a little scary because they turned all of these rooms that hosted mentally ill patients, and there are lots of horror stories about the history of psychiatric care at Richardson Complex, and now it's a hotel, and it's kind of this weird feeling, but there are some parts of the complex that is not renovated that this picture is coming from. And in some regards, a lot of patients have suffered there, and a lot of family members are actually trying to access the records of their loved ones who had died at Richardson Complex, but they can't for various patient privacy laws and so on. So a lot of the kind of suffering experiences that they had are inaudible and inaccessible at this point. And in a way, this kind of project is a tribute to people who could not speak about their experiences involving mental illness. So mental illness research kind of, reminds us this, parable of like six blind men and the elephant. I'm sure, you know how the story goes. So six blind men get asked to describe an elephant by just touching it. And they all say, like one of them says it's a spear, one of them says it's a fan, a snake. They're all kind of describing it in different ways just based on their experiences. And unfortunately, contemporary research on mental illness is going something like that. It's a very hard, complex, puzzling phenomenon. A lot of scientists, clinicians, patients themselves are trying to make sense of it and so on, but there is really not a lot of agreement in what these researchers are saying. There is one thing that's clear, though, that a lot of the research inquiry in psychiatry has one, big goal. The goal is to find a way to effectively and ethically treat people with mental disorders. So in that sense, I'd like to think of psychiatry as intervention-oriented science, where scientists conduct research so that they can identify the properties of mental disorders. And these properties then ideally helps us describe what mental disorders are and how they will progress and how they will go on time, so that we can make good predictions as to how somebody's depression is unfolding, so that ultimately we develop effective interventions. And the goal is not to kind of only understand, my depression or your depression, but the goal is to kind of create a generalizable story, an explanation of why depression occurs and how it unfolds in an individual's life, so that we can form reliable generalizations. And that's why it becomes a scientific project. So in that sense, if we think about psychiatric epistemology as a kind of knowledge building exercise, building knowledge about the properties of mental disorders so that we can explain, predict, and intervene on them, we can kind of look at a number of, outlets to give us information about what mental disorders are. So one is scientific research. And this is the kind of scientific research that is based on third-person observations that are kind of usually involve large scales, clinical trials, and so on, so that we can almost arrive at these generalizable laws or nomothetic knowledge about how mental disorders unfold. So clinical drug trials, for instance, are good examples for this large-scale research programs. Another source of information that would give us information about the properties of mental disorders would be testimony. That is the experiences, the reports of the individuals who are directly experiencing mental disorder, their descriptions of what it is like to have mental illness. In addition, maybe their family members. Sometimes, if you have a family member who have addiction problems, sometimes the person herself is in denial that they have a substance abuse problem, but the family members are aware. So this kind of first and second person testimonies are also important parts of the puzzle for us to expand our understanding of mental disorders. In some sense, we can call this idiographic knowledge, where the focus is on specifiable and particular facts, not the super generalizable facts, but more individualized specific facts. And ultimately, clinical research, that's just coming directly from the clinician's direct experience, direct encounter with patients. And examples of this are clinical case studies where doctors or clinicians gather some relevant information about a particular condition and how that unfolds. So interestingly, my worry that I will be focusing today is that the dominant scientific frameworks have extensively relied on scientific and clinical data to advance knowledge on mental disorders. So there was a lot of emphasis on finding these laws or generalizable characters of mental disorders, interventions that affect people in a large scale, and so on. So that there's a lot of room for that in contemporary scientific psychiatry. However, researchers have not been committed to using patient testimonies as sources of information. So in this talk, I will only focus on patients' own testimonies based on their own experiences with mental disorders, but I'm open to thinking about second-person perspectives, the testimonies of family members and so on, and also providing some information about the nature of mental disorders. So in that sense, there is an overemphasis on nomothetic knowledge and underappreciation of what idiographic knowledge can provide us in understanding mental disorders. And one kind of symptom of this, for the lack of a better word, or one way in which we see this is that individuals who are diagnosed with mental disorders have not been systematically made part of scientific inquiry into mental disorders, even though a lot of, I will talk about this in a minute, even though a lot of the research programs in psychiatry involve several members of the public as experts. Patients have never been considered as experts. So in this talk, I will kind of trace this problem into the kind of what I call twin assumptions of scientific psychiatry. So there are two assumptions that seem to be operating behind scientific psychiatry. One is that individuals with mental disorders lack the expertise required to make meaningful contributions in the scientific investigation of mental disorders. That seems to be one assumption. And connected to this assumption, maybe concomitant to it, is that subjectivity of patient testimonies will impede psychiatry's commitment to being an objective science. So those two assumptions seem to be driving, they seem to be under the underlying factor that kind of led scientific psychiatrists to push away patients' perspectives or patients' contribution in scientific psychiatry. So I will challenge the twin assumptions by arguing that patients could be defined as experience-based experts who would be able to provide meaningful contributions in the scientific knowledge on mental disorders, and that, in fact, patient testimonies are indispensable for arriving at objectivity in psychiatry. And I will try to show why I think you should be convinced by these arguments as opposed to the orthodox view. And then I will raise some potential objections to my view and try to respond to them. So here are the twin assumptions. Individuals with mental disorders lack the expertise required to make meaningful scientific contributions to psychiatry, and subjectivity will impede psychiatry's commitments to objectivity. So where does this come from? So I'm going to focus specifically on the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in this talk as an example. I could give other examples as well, but I'd like to focus on the DSM because it has a lot of power and circulation in both scientific and clinical communities. It's kind of starting to change, which I'm not going to talk about it at this moment. So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders is a book, basically, that comprises the kind of latest state-of-the-art knowledge and information about mental disorders, or at least that's the commitment that the DSM makes in kind of being the main book or the Bible of psychiatry. It has 5 editions and it is continually revised because the idea is the more scientific research we conduct on mental disorders, the better we will understand them, so that this book is a live document that will be, subject to change. It's used in scientific research contexts when clinicians are running clinical trials and so on, or when they're selecting patients to look at their neural structures, we look for the same diagnosis. It's also used in the clinical context in a variety of public policy contexts, education, medical education, getting off time from work because of mental disorder for disability reasons and so on. So it has like this all-powerful document. So when we look at the evolution of the DSM, there's like a really interesting history. So it didn't start off as a medical or diagnostic document. It did not start off as a scientific document that will collect all the information that we have about mental disorders. Rather, at the time it was created, there were a number of wars, and in this particular case, the government was trying to decide who to send to the Korean War and who is fit to serve in the military. So initially, the first DSM and the preliminary versions of the DSM was just a statistical document that kind of listed a broad criteria for how should we characterize mental disorders, and based on which, who should we eliminate and who should we not eliminate in sending to the front. So because we want the strongest army. So, and the first 2 DSMs, there wasn't a robust scientific focus, and it was heavily influenced by the descriptions or understanding of mental disorder that was dominant at the time, which is psychoanalytic psychology. So when you look at the introduction to the first and the second DSM and analyze the document, a lot of mental disorders are described as reactions to some psychic phenomena. There are underlying pressures that are derived from childhood sexual experiences that causes psychopathology and so on. So it's a pretty kind of theoretically loaded framework for mental disorders. So this was 1950s and 1968. And at that time, for a number of reasons, like for example, the document that provided the criteria for mental disorders in North America was a DSM, and it was the criteria for mental disorders was significantly different from the international classification of diseases, which is used in Europe. So there was lots of problems with reliability, that you could be diagnosed with schizophrenia in North America, but you would not have any problems, say, in the UK where the ICD was used. So there were a number of problems about the scientific status of the DSM, to be briefly. So a number of philosophers have actually criticized this kind of abstract theoretical orientation of the DSM in their criticisms of the of psychoanalytic psychology, like Popper and Hempel and Grunbaum famously. And they were coming from a lot more logical positivistic background and challenging how psychiatry is just this nebulous science. And philosophers were not the only ones who regarded psychiatry as not quite scientific. Do you watch Mad Men? So the voice quality is not the best in this video, but I'll try to. It will be clear. So he says, I don't want to be a psychiatrist. It's not medicine. Might as well work in a bank. So this is 1950s New York City. And that was actually pretty much the feeling around the times that people like Grunbaum and Popper were criticizing psychoanalysis and psychiatry. Like psychiatry was not regarded as like real genuine science. So that kind of was the, feeling. In response, the creators of the DSM made a radical change in the way mental disorders are defined. They stopped using the psychoanalytic framework, and instead, starting with the DSM-3, moving on to DSM-4 and 5, mental disorders were defined in terms of behavior by looking at the observable signs and symptoms of mental disorders. So that focus on the behavior made it more scientific, because now we have actually something that we can operationalize and we can understand and focus. By looking at people's behavior, we can determine whether they have mental illness or not. So the DSM as we know it now, and its focus on the symptoms and signs of mental disorder, is kind of the residue of the psychiatry's attempts to establish itself as a more scientific discipline. So this meant that the group, the American Psychiatric Association, who puts together the DSM, referred to extensively kind of having used the state-of-the-art, cutting-edge, latest research in characterizing the features of mental disorder. So again, if you do a historical review of all of these documents, there's a lot of emphasis on how the experts, world-renowned experts, were consulted in the creation of the DSM. So, and the expertise that seems to be operative in their assumption is that technical or professional expertise, meaning when they refer to someone as an expert, they usually mean people who are trained in psychopathology with recognized degrees, MDs and PhDs and so on. So there's a focus on this kind of third-person expertise in giving us information about mental disorders. Again, there's a lot of and this is almost used as a tool to legitimize, for the APA, to legitimize itself as a properly scientific community that is providing scientific criteria for mental disorders. They write about how they consult psychiatrists in Canada, in different states, and so on and so forth. So, and patients themselves were never considered to be as experts or as potentially providing any sort of information on mental disorders. And this continued basically from the DSM-1 to DSM-4, 1952, DSM-4, when DSM-4 was published in 1994. Starting with the DSM-5, things have started changing. So one example, for instance, in the DSM-3, initially homosexuality was defined as a mental disorder, as I'm sure many of you know about this. And after extensive lobbying and so forth, they got rid of the classification of homosexuality as a mental illness, and that was thankfully, thanks to a lot of homosexual psychiatrists within the psychiatric community. So it wasn't a response to kind of engaging with, the public concerns about psychiatric taxonomy and so on. It had more to do with the political context in which psychiatrists were working under. So starting with the DSM-5, there was a lot of pressure on the APA to start including patients as in the committee that makes decisions about psychiatric diagnostic criteria. So the way in which DSM work groups. So there's this larger group that's like their DSM-5 task force, and that task force has like 5-6 people, and then there are like lots of different working groups that focuses on specialized mental disorders and so on, and each of those groups have a number of clinicians and scientists in them. So there was pressure on them to also include some patients and other stakeholders, other consumers of psychiatric diagnosis, to be also involved in that process. So one example of this was coming from patient advocacy groups that was critical of the way in which APA was determining the criteria for mental disorders. This is 2013 in San Francisco. There was that was the year that the DSM-5 was coming out, and there were lots of protests organized by patients, advocacy committees that criticized the way in which psychiatry historically have neglected, or scientific psychiatry have neglected patients' input and patients' perspective. It was Occupy movement was on the rise that year, so they called it Occupy the APA. And philosophers and clinicians and psychiatrists also pitched in. They published articles that invited the APA to invite patients and perhaps their family members to be part of the DSM-5 decision-making process. When we kind of look at the kinds of invitations, their argument goes something like this. So democracy requires all stakeholders to be part of the DSM decision-making process, because these particular commentators see the DSM production process as a political process, not just a scientific process, but a political process. So democracy requires all stakeholders to be involved, and patients are stakeholders. They are directly influenced by the criteria for mental disorder diagnosis, and that therefore patients must be included in the DSM decision-making process. I'm in full agreement with this idea, but I kind of want to say this is endorsing the inclusion of patients for social and political reasons, not just for purely epistemic reasons. And I want to say that it's not just socially and politically important for us to be inclusive of all stakeholders in the DSM-5 decision-making process, but it's also an epistemic question about how to arrive at the best kind of knowledge about a phenomenon, something as complex as mental illness. And unless we have patients who are directly encountering mental disorder at the table, contributing to that production, we can't arrive at. So, and some clinicians actually have written some like short articles that show, because they were trying to justify including patients in their small working groups. So they published these papers. So this is a really good article, for instance, where two clinicians and the bioethicists write this paper about how patient subjective data, that's how they put patient testimony, patient subjective data might fill in the gaps produced by qualitative studies. Again, this is great, better than nothing, but I don't think that this is good enough, because here patient perspectives are presented only as ancillary to the main kind of knowledge that is arrived by the experts through various quantitative studies. So it's not taking the kind of central place. And the DSM-5 task force actually was receptive, or seemed receptive, to the idea of including patients. But again, their receptivity was more kind of coming from a social and political standpoint than an epistemic standpoint. So they said, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Of course, we will open the DSM-5 like preliminary criteria open for public commentary. And we will ask the public to give us feedback on what they think about this criteria. So there's a huge difference between asking the general public right? Who may or may not be affected by mental illness, may or may not know anything about mental illness, to give feedback versus directly actually going to patients and asking them to be part of that process. So I do not necessarily see this kind of giving uptake to the epistemological contribution that patients can make. Nonetheless, that's what they did. They opened the DSM-5 for public feedback. You could actually provide feedback. So this was in 2010 when they opened it for public commentary, 10 and 11. And I was just about to finish my dissertation, which was on the DSM. So I wrote a lot of comments, but it's this like, you send it to the oblivion. You don't get a confirmation message. You don't know if they're seeing it. It's like applying for immigration or something. You just mail it and you're like, okay, I'm just going to wait now. So, but I don't know, like I'm not aware of any kind of critical analysis that shows how they engage with public commentary, but they said, David Kupfert, who was a chair of the task force, said that they engaged with it and it was great. So, one important thing here is that I think to emphasize, and this is kind of the driving force for this paper, is that they're not open to it epistemically. Again, patient contribution does not seem to be a big deal for them from an epistemic standpoint. Rather, when you kind of dig a little bit deeper, they say things like this. Well, great, yes. So they respond. So this article is a response to the former article that said include patient subjective data. And again, this is a very kind of glossing over response where they say, yeah, thanks so much for this. Now we're opening it for public commentary. We don't have that much time to include like individual patients. And also, by definition, subjectivity, this is what would be coming from patients, is variable from person to person, therefore making it impossible to develop objective criteria that would apply to every disorder. Further, it raises the question of whose subjective experience will serve as a template by which criteria would be developed. So we could kind of take this as a challenge for, the kind of epistemic argument, right? Okay, great. So you want to enhance knowledge on mental disorders by including patients, but how can we still claim for psychiatry to be objective science if you're including these like subjective viewpoints? The fundamental problem here is that the notion of objectivity, and similarly the notion of subjectivity, is insufficiently explained. They do not actually tell us explicitly what they mean by objectivity or subjectivity, and precisely how subjectivity will be an impediment to objectivity. And as philosophers of science, we know that both of these notions are highly loaded, very important. We trust science. We love science because we think that it's objective, but we disagree on what exactly we mean by objectivity of science. But let's see what they might mean. So they say, well, there's going to be interpersonal variability of subjective data. So if I want to include the patients and say, ask for their input for the depression diagnosis, then they will be saying different things. So how am I going to kind of generalize that information to a larger scale? Plus, whose first-person perspective I will count? Will I trust Megan's first-person perspective or Mike's first-person perspective, which will be the kind of more reliable? So, and they seem to kind of think that this is an obstacle against psychiatry's commitment to be an objective science. So what might they be meaning by objectivity? Again, if you look at philosophy of science, there might be a number of things operative here. So they might be talking about like psychiatry being a value-free science, or being a detached science from individuals who are kind of participating in it. They might mean like impartiality, where there's no like single bias affecting the kind of knowledge that's being produced. And like they seem to be assuming that this kind of objective data can only come from like the experts who are, observing people with mental disorders. So that's insufficiently examined. And nevertheless, so all of this, DSM-5 was published, and then later on, kind of this focus on the kind of trusting more to third-person perspectives on mental disorders seems to be the kind of now dominant way of framing what kind of science psychiatry is. We have a lot of investment research resources being dedicated for the research and domain criteria project that focuses primarily on the genetics and neural basis of mental disorders without focusing exclusively on mental disorders themselves. And a lot of the kind of, if you look at the NIMH's research budget, National Institute of Mental Health research budget, which is the largest funding agency in the world that provide research support for mental disorder research, they're all focused primarily on this third-person perspective, third-person analysis of scientific inquiry into mental disorders. So here's what I'm going to say. I will say that patients must be included in the scientific investigation of mental disorders for epistemic reasons. So I'm not going to talk about the social and political reasons. I agree with them, but I think it's also indispensable that they be included to make scientific knowledge about mental disorders complete. And that these twin assumptions are wrong on the one hand, but for me to kind of convince that patients must be included, I have to respond to the challenge about expertise, right? There's the assumption is that clinicians or people who are trained in psychopathology are the ones who are the only experts. And I'm going to challenge that by saying, well, we can think about different kinds of expertise in scientific inquiry and consider patients to be one kind of expert among the others, which I will refer to as experience-based experts, borrowing language from science studies. And two, patient testimonies are, in fact, indispensable for scientific objectivity. Here, I'm going to kind of encourage clinical or scientific psychiatrists to move away from more positivistic ideas of objectivity to a more kind of updated and contextualist analysis of objectivity. So let's look at the first assumption. So this seems to be the assumption that patients lack expertise. Instead, I say, well, let's kind of define different kinds of expertise in scientific inquiry. And in that sense, we can talk about the trained experts who have MD or PhD degrees, who are experts on psychopathology, but we can also classify this other group of experts who we might call, again, following Collins and Evans, technically qualified by experienced contributors to scientific decision making. So what make patients kind of like technically qualified? So when I say experience-based experts, I mean something like members of the public who have special technical expertise in virtue of experience that is not recognized by degrees or other certificates, right? So what kind of expertise do patients have? What can actually we learn from patients that we would not be able to readily find from the experts, from the clinicians? And for this, kind of my main basis of evidence so far is the first-person memoirs written by people who have encountered mental disorders. So I've been using first-person analysis, first-person memoirs of patients as one of the ways in which I illustrate my arguments in philosophy of psychiatry. And like for this talk, I kind of decided to have this like more global look on actually what exactly are they offering to the table. In a way, kind of I'm taking cues from Lorraine Coe's influential book on like what can she know, where she kind of focused on the gender of S in the S knows P description of knowledge, and kind of told us about how knowledge can be situated and depending on who the knower is. And in that sense, we can kind of look at what exactly patients can know. So first of all, we learn a lot from reading what patients write or talking to them, what kind of orientational challenges that they encounter in mental illness. And by orientational challenges, I mean something like the direct experience of like depression, like not being able to leave bed when you wake up in the morning. So like that kind of raw, like existential, fundamental level in which mental disorder can impact a person. Another kind of way in which we can, and something else that we can learn from patients, and not necessarily from other kinds of knowledge-bearing systems, is how exactly a particular treatment affected them. So I refer to this as the therapeutic impact of psychiatric diagnosis. So whether or not being diagnosed with depression, and if so, how they actually affected in the way that they respond to their mental illness, their depression. Another impact of psychiatric diagnosis that is not often quite talked about in the direct clinical literature, but philosophers like Hacking have talked a lot about it, is like the reflective impact of mental illness, meaning how psychiatric diagnosis informs the way in which individuals understand themselves, how it affects their self-concepts and even personal identity at times. And he referred to this phenomenon as looping effects. In addition, what we find in these narratives, in these testimonies, that we wouldn't find, say, in the DSM's diagnostic criteria for depression, is like these what I call hyper-narrative, these detailed stories of what is involved in people's depression. So reading a first-person account of a Black woman's depression, for instance, might give us a lot of insights about how, racist society structure, poverty, and so on actually shaped and affected their depression, which would be really, really important information to know, especially in the clinical context. And again, all of these kind of bits of information that comes from patient memoirs are central in clinical treatment, right? I started my talk by talking about how psychiatry is an intervention-oriented science, and therefore coming directly from patients themselves about the ways in which various psychiatric treatments might or might not work and so on is really good piece of information that we would not be able to obtain from anywhere else. We can learn a lot about the way in which they coped with various stigma and how they survived or flourished withstanding their mental illness and so on. So there's a lot of things that we can learn from patients by relying on their testimonies. So what's really interesting and unique about testimonial knowledge in this case is that they might offer evidence that might be overlooked in conventional clinical settings. So a philosopher of medicine, Rachel Ankeny, talks about clinical case studies in medicine, and she talks about how there are these pockets of little information-bearing systems that give us more detailed descriptions of what the patient is encountering or what kind of illness that the clinician is dealing with. And she advocates, for instance, including first-person perspectives in the clinical case studies, not because it will give us the final word on what that illness is, but it might be a way for us to gather information, maybe that is not typical, maybe that's in fact atypical, but we might see down the road in some other kind of patient, right? So in a way, in kind of efforts to find generalizations or patterns or trends in various psychiatric phenomena, we are kind of overlooking these little details that might in fact be pertinent for us to understanding or effectively intervening on that mental disorder. And this does not necessarily make testimonial knowledge like unscientific. It can in fact be very empirical, like finding out people's gender and race and socioeconomic status is actually very objectively kind of empirically it can be conducted empirically. We can find out a lot of information about how those particular dimensions of their identities might be affecting the way that they live in the world and how their mental disorders might be shaped. So in this sense, testimonial knowledge is providing us idiographic knowledge that is in addition to nomothetic knowledge. So it's not competing with the kind of more traditional third-person perspectives or approaches, but rather complementing that kind of information. So, and it's the mistake, I believe, that to develop effective interventions, all we need is these like large-scale, generalizable data. No, in fact, we might actually, the very thing that we might need is like more specific, detailed, idiographic forms of knowledge. So that's like the first kind of response, right? Like I'm kind of inviting us to think about patients also as kind of experts that will help us in enhancing psychiatric knowledge. Here the second challenge comes, and that was kind of there in the DSM-5 task force's response to the call for inviting patients in the process, which is that, well, their testimonies will be subjective, but here we are trying to do science, we're trying to be objective, and that might impede objectivity. So I think this is misguided because, in fact, rather, if we want an objective science, we should be including patients in the process. Again, recall that we couldn't determine what exactly they meant by objectivity. That was unclear. And it might be being value-free, being detached, being impartial, or coming just from third-person perspective. But we can kind of sympathize with that idea of like science being an objective science that is reliably giving us information that we can make kind of similar interventions and similar explanations and so on. So in that sense, that's a laudable goal to strive at objectivity. But the kind of objectivity that these psychiatrists and scientific psychiatrists seem to be operating under is the rather kind of traditional approach to objectivity that we see historically in the logical positivistic movement, where the focus or objectivity is defined by primarily a focus on the output of scientific knowledge process, right? What we end up finding. So there's a lot of emphasis on scientific knowledge being knowledge from like a view from nowhere, where justification for scientific evidence is grounded primarily on observational data, and that is verifiable by the world. So that's the kind of ideal goal for objectivity, where there's no room for values. It's this kind of God's point of view, God's eye point of view, look at the reality. But that notion of objectivity was challenged in post-Kuhn area, especially by the arguments developed by like Helen Longino traditionally, and more recently Heather Douglas, where there's more focus on the process of producing scientific knowledge, how we actually conduct scientific research, where, with the agreement that science is not this individual activity, it's a community activity, people are necessarily involved in scientific knowledge production process because scientists are people, where justification for scientific evidence depends on values. Values are intrinsic part of scientific process, and value neutrality is false. And good science is not necessarily detached or value-free, but it can still be objective, right? At least that's the kind of, that's good news. Like we cannot have all of these as part of our scientific process, but it can still be objective. How would that be how would science be objective? That very social feature of science, Longino says, is necessary for scientific objectivity. So, it seems to me that the kind of the worries around the objectivity being disrupted in psychiatry by including patients' perspectives or subjective perspectives, as they put it, seems to be characterizing objectivity primarily as view from nowhere, where the focus seems to be on the output of scientific knowledge process. But instead, I think the very nature of psychiatric research that's being conducted now, especially in the DSM framework, is open to being interpreted in a more contextualist framework, because already there is an acknowledgement that mental disorder is a very complex phenomenon. So we want to bring all these different kinds of experts to the table and, get them kind of talking and show evidence for their particular orientations and so on. So there's already that process. And if we instead think of scientific objectivity as procedural objectivity, we can kind of think about it being an actually objective science. So Longino's response to the problem of objectivity in science was, well, look, so scientists are people, they come together, they sit at the table, they all have their own particular perspectives, but what makes that scientific knowledge process objective in the end is the very existence of those alternative viewpoints. So every information goes through this transformative criticism process where everyone criticizes each other, and then we all hopefully arrive at some kind of consensus about the nature of the phenomenon that we are investigating. So we can apply can easily apply that framework to psychiatric context. So here's one limitation of, I think, just relying on Longino purely, because when she was talking about transformative criticism, she was focusing primarily on the scientific community. So in a way, it was a prerequisite for her, for all of the participants of knowledge production to be scientists. I think that we can relax that notion a little bit and maybe think about the community, scientific community, being comprised of experts, where they're both the both the trained experts who have training in psychopathology and so on, and also experts who are experts based on experience. So in that sense, I want to kind of call my approach to objectivity in psychiatry participatory intersubjective objectivity, where the community of knowers include both the technically qualified experts and the experience-based experts, which would then mean patients would be part of the picture. And psychiatric knowledge will be arrived through the process of transformative criticism. So clinicians may not buy what the patients say and vice versa, but they will all be talking to each other and communicating with each other with the ultimate goal of finding the best kinds of interventions that we can develop for people with mental disorders. And in that sense, the very subjectivity of patients' standpoint is actually an asset, not a liability for objectivity. In fact, we need that to kind of make sure that the information that we are producing, the knowledge that we are producing, is actually the kind of knowledge that will yield to effective interventions in psychiatry. Including patients in the knowledge production process will allow criticism from different points of view, and members of the scientific community or kind of the community of knowers can subject each other's views to critical scrutiny. And this will limit the intrusion of purely subjective preferences into scientific knowledge. Because when clinicians or when scientific psychiatrists say that they're worried about the subjectivity of the patients, I think they're discounting the fact that by themselves, psychiatrists themselves come to the table with a lot of theoretical assumptions about what mental disorders are. So the fact that they're the ones who are producing knowledge does not make psychiatric knowledge less tainted than it would make when patients are brought to the table. But by kind of inviting different parties to be part of the knowledge production community, we can at least ideally find a way to check those individual biases and theoretical commitments and so on. So this is all great. And somebody might say, but you're missing some one obvious point that maybe have led to the kind of exclusion of people with mental illness from the community of knowers in the first place, which is, well, they're crazy. They lack, I mean, they wouldn't say probably crazy, hopefully not, but they might say, well, mental ill patients lack rational decision-making capacity. How can we actually trust what they're saying? How can we trust that they will not make a scene in the middle of the committee meeting? How can we trust their, what they are bringing to table, basically? So there might be like a number of kind of concerns there. So my students think this. My students think that patients lack rational decision-making capacity. And then we start reading patient testimonies, watching some videos, and kind of talking about patient experience in general. They're like, oh, not really, actually. She was able to do this. And then they start realizing that this idea of rational decision-making capacity itself, not something super specific. It's not clearly defined. Rather, as we know from research in cognitive science, rational decision-making capacity can be really local. So first of all, there's no conclusive data that would support that all mentally ill patients lack rational capacity. We don't have any conclusive evidence. In fact, what we know is coming from a lot of research that's conducted by psychiatrists and bioethicists that patients are capable of rational decision making. It all depends on the context. But that said, it's true. There might be, we can talk about limited epistemic agency, some mental disorders are episodic. Sometimes people are like perfect, great, doing great, and then they have a dip, and then things are not great. So there can be shifts in one's capacity to be a reliable epistemic agent, but this is also like we need to be kind of more specific and focused than this. So we know that mental illnesses do not necessarily nor universally interrupt epistemic agency. So not all conditions create impediments. So there's a significant difference, for instance, between schizophrenia and like depression in that regard. And if they do kind of create some kind of impediments on rational decision-making capacities, they vary in degrees of severity, or they might be transient, they might not be consistent. And the other kind of, I think the biggest issue is that these kinds of problems are also there when we are selecting the committee members in the DSM-5 decision-making process, for instance, right? In that context, maybe we will have concerns about who has the best kind of expertise to play a role in this committee, what's their research background, and so on. So, and in the kind of transformative criticism process that I'm imagining psychiatry adopt, there will be some kind of selection criteria, maybe different from the current selection criteria, but there will be some kind of criteria where we will be able to kind of identify the best candidates who can actually participate and make meaningful contribution to the process of knowledge generating in psychiatry. So, by the way, this was a primarily kind of abstract theoretical talk. I don't have a lot of answers as to directly how we can implement this in practice. That's a kind of later talk. I have some ideas about that, but I wanted to work with some existing assumptions and show that those assumptions are not necessarily true. So then the upshot is, what I'm proposing here is an epistemic division of labor in psychiatry or scientific psychiatry that has, trilateral strategy, what I call trilateral strategy, to arrive at this participatory intersubjective objectivity. So it has three legs. One is testimony, so that's one ground for knowledge. And again, this could be first person or second person perspective, coming from patients themselves, their family members, and so on. The second, and even some clinicians' own testimonies about their encounter with patients, which is also happening now. A lot of psychiatrists are coming out and writing their confessions. Actually, there's one confession coming soon in the newsletter of an organization that I'm a member, Association for the Advancement of Philosophy and Psychiatry, where a psychiatrist actually wrote about the history of his disappointments with scientific psychiatry and so on. So it's really interesting. So testimony is then a good source of information for us to look at. In addition to already existing scientific research on mental disorders, as well as clinical research on mental disorders, this is maybe also important to point out. So psychiatric research is not unified. So there's academic and more research psychiatry people who don't really see patients a lot, and there are clinicians who see a lot of patients, and they they base their work on that. And there's a lot of communication or connection between those two groups. So this kind of, in this ideal picture, they actually all talk to each other and participate in what I call the transformative criticism process. And I think I see philosophers as essential to this process because anything that they can do, we can do meta and and also talk about the ethical implications of a lot of these research paradigms and programs. Ultimately, I'll go back to where we started. This is all because psychiatry is an interaction-based science. I mean, Hippocrates, it's like never wrong to go back to him. He said it's more important to know what sort of person has a disease than to know what sort of disease a person has. So this kind of person-centric information is crucial for the kind of aims that psychiatry has as a branch of science, which is to find effective interventions. So, and I wanted to end with this video where Jesus says it's elephant. So thank you for your time.
Oh, sorry, I'm calling. Sorry.
guess you're thinking.
I hear you looking at me, and I'm like, why are you looking?
Yeah. So I had so one question was just, are there cases where idiographic knowledge has really transformed our understanding of a particular disorder? So
yeah, actually there was a slide and it got deleted in the process. Yes, that's a great question. So one thing that is one of my favorite examples is about schizophrenia. So in schizophrenia diagnostic criteria in the DSM, there's a clause that says lack of interest in relationships and people and communication or something like that. And that's actually wildly inaccurate. In fact, a lot of the time in schizophrenia case, patients really want to communicate and contact and connect, but they just can't. So it's not lack of desire, it's lack of ability or lack of something else. So those kinds of things are important. Again, with respect to schizophrenia, a lot of phenomenologically oriented clinical psychiatrists think of schizophrenia as a direct disorder of the self, where there are kind of wild disconnections between patients' experience and their concept of that experience. Again, that's not part of the diagnostic framework. There's some other work on obsessive compulsive disorder that has very specific, unique pictures that, again, we don't see in the DSM criteria. So, yeah.
Interesting. So I also, sorry if I could get a follow-up. Yeah. So I was also curious whether whether this was part of a broader story of just sort of a clash of methodologies in psychiatry, because one thing that seems striking is if you think of sort of more clinical or medical research in psychiatry, the sort of methodologies you use would be very different than taking transcripts of testimonies and doing sort of qualitative work on case studies. And so I'm curious whether it's not just a sort of ideology about that subjective and they're not experts, but it also might just be, well, we've adopted a methodology in which we're more used to using trials or some other methodology to assess questions. And then there's this other type of methodology that might actually be harder to do in some ways. So there might be a practical issue as well as the more ideological, it's not objective.
No, that's great. That's a great question. I think they all simultaneously affect the story, so there's not a single story. But one important and interesting thing is, I think this is part of the story of psychiatry's evolution as a branch of medicine, that it always tried to side itself with more natural sciences or biological sciences rather than, say, social sciences or anthropology and so on. And interestingly, psychiatry doesn't even align itself with psychology, right? So in this kind of that history, here, that's kind of part of my larger project. One of the arguments I make here is that so there is a history of psychoanalysis and then kind of competition of behaviorism, and there was a shift to focus on the symptoms and signs of mental disorders, and that actually coincided with the rise of the medical model. So in 1940s, 50s, we found that syphilis can be cured by antibiotics, and syphilis has a lot of mental illness kind of symptoms towards the end stage. So that kind of increased the optimism that we can be this traditional medicine and find cures for mental disorders. And in this whole story, if you look at history of psychology, cognitive science and cognitive revolution happens in trying to find a place for cognition somewhere between psychoanalysis and behaviorism, but that is kind of sidestepped by psychiatry. They kind of stick with behaviorism because drugs come to the rescue too. I mean, the bipolar drug, the most effective bipolar disorder drug was lithium. Lithium was invented in 1970s, and that was a huge breakthrough that increased people's optimism even more. So I think that's part of the problem. So part of me wants to say, there are different kind of research paradigms, but unfortunately, because a lot of medical or psychiatric research is funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, and they have a favoring of biological sciences, a lot of the kind of research that I'm curious to see more, anthropology, sociology, and psychology, there's not as well competing. I've been trying to, I'm collaborating with a colleague in our psychology department at UTSA, and he was complaining about this. There's just so much emphasis on quantitative analysis that even finding in a huge psychology department people who does qualitative analysis is like really, really hard. So I think that that's my biggest worry, that we are kind of almost erasing the conceptual framework for this kind of work to actually make itself to scientific research. But yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this talk. I have so many thoughts and questions, but I'm going to focus on two. One is you talk a lot about who counts as an expert and who has knowledge as an expert, and I was wondering if you could maybe relate that to the concept of evidence in medicine, because I think one of the big issues is that in medicine you're taught that our medical model is evidence-based medicine, and you go to med school and you're taught like, we look at the evidence, but what counts and what has resulted from evidence-based medicine is this hierarchy of what counts as the best evidence being a systematic review of a double-blinded randomized controlled trial. And so it's this epidemiological, population-based evidence that's considered the best, and something like this is anecdotal evidence that's considered the worst. So how do you kind of use what your research to challenge the foundations of evidence-based medicine being the hegemonic medical model? So that's one question. And my other question is, then when you do bring in these memoirs, what are the limitations to you using memoirs? I spent some time doing research in the UK as well, where they're kind of moving away from narrative understandings of illness to perhaps more phenomenological. I know the phenomenology can be captured in the narrative, but also there are, I think, some real criticisms of this. There's been a big focus on narratives as being a way to maybe humanize medicine or get us to think about the individual particularities. But then what sometimes happens is we get like a certain kind of narrative that keeps recurring. So especially in mental illness, the recovery narrative. Like that comes up again and again and again, and I think it's facilitated by like the longer narrative forms like the memoir, whereas poetry by patients is not taken up as much. So I was wondering, if you could talk about evidence in relation to what you're doing, and also issues that come up with specific narrative forms that you're using.
They're both great questions. I can't, I'm only one person, so I can't address all of these things, but here is in my research program, but here are the things that I think are important to consider. So, yes, hierarchy of evidence, anecdote, even when you're sending a paper for review, you get this look when you're using patient narratives because that's not real evidence and so on. So in the past, I've kind of presented work that makes a case for why testimony is a form of type of evidence. And I think, in maybe traditional medical approaches, that hierarchy is there. But I think even in traditional medicine, that's kind of getting softened. When we think about other complex illnesses like HIV, where a personal tailored treatment is almost a requirement, even though they all have the same virus and so on, depending on person's life decisions and so on, life choices. So I think there is a way in which to kind of sneak in that testimonial knowledge into the kind of range of evidence, and I think a larger case should be made about why we might think of patient testimony as a sort of evidence. Because I think part of that hierarchical model of viewing evidence has to do with it comes with the assumption that higher level, this is the best form of evidence and this is the worst form of evidence. What I'm trying to say instead is well, they're all different kinds of evidence. Sullivan's work on pluralisms and perspectival pluralism is, I think, a great example. We can have different perspectives and different methodologies that all kind of coexist, and especially if we have a specific goal like treating people with mental illness and so on. So that's the first thought. The second thought is about narratives and limitations of the testimonial knowledge. So Somoj Varga and Jennifer Radin have written about the truth problem in testimony. I mean, just by nature of being someone's memoir or someone's autobiography, it's not always getting at the truth, so that might be a potential limitation, a potential problem of a narrative. And not all narratives have the same quality. In fact, one of the things that I found in my dissertation work is a lot of these memoirs suffer from what I call hypo-narrative. They take on board the diagnostic classification, symptom-based descriptions of mental disorders in talking about their experiences that actually you don't really know what that experience is. So there's a particular memoir, for instance, where the woman talks about how she was high and low and high and low. The entire memoir is about how high and how low she was, but there's very little context to which, okay, what was she high again? Like, why was this again? So there's not a lot of like in-depth analysis. And I think that's a particular kind of harm to the patient themselves because they don't have the kind of conceptual framework to think about their experiences in anything other than the language of symptoms. And I think in that context, maybe reading poetry or thinking about like metaphors and so on might have been a lot more useful. So in that sense, like definitely memoirs are like limited and testimony is limited, but it also has so many resources. Science, psychology now is in battling with replication crisis, right? So there are all these different problems that come with each methodology, but we don't just like disregard that form of methodology. And I think that's something that we should try to do. About the shift from narrativity to phenomenology, I'm kind of biased in that because a lot of what passes as phenomenology of illness is grounded on historical phenomenological approaches to the human mind. So a lot of great philosophers use Merleau-Ponty or Husserl as a starting point to interpret patients' experience. I think that's provided so much theoretical framework into the raw, authentic descriptions of illness. So I'm a little bit worried about that. If by phenomenology we just mean the method of listening to someone's story and analyzing that, I'm all on board with that, but I don't really appreciate the kind of imposition of Merleau-Ponty or Husserl into this kind of framework, because then I think you need to learn Husserl to understand what the patient is talking about and so that's not methodologically super attractive to me, but yeah.
I think that's like a really good point, because in health sciences research, I feel like the really trendy thing is like to do a phenomenological study, and it's like people who have probably never read any phenomenology, but it's just like this method that's imposed on the usually interview transcripts all the time.
There's this great letter interaction between David Carr, who's a phenomenologist, and Daniel Dennett, where Carr is criticizing Dennett's use of phenomenology. Dennett talks about phenomenology and heterophenomenology in this like very scientific method kind of way, like first person perspective, second perspective, and they talk. And Carr is criticizing his reading habits because he doesn't make any references to the historical Husserlian or Merleau-Pontian approaches to phenomenology and so on. So I think I'm more of a Dennett kind of phenomenology fan than the other way around. But
is it okay if I'm just going to add?
Yeah.
So, because it follows up on this a bit. So, I'm just wondering, like, you say that, you accuse kind of the DSM authors of going after this aim of objectivity, but in some sense, one of the reasons why they wanted these categories to be defined in terms of observable surface features, or however we want to talk about that, was because they wanted to all be able to say, we're diagnosing patients similarly, we're talking about the same phenomena. So it was a way in which to stabilize the phenomena that they were looking at. And one of the criticisms has been, coming from Thomas Insel, that kind of stability, that reason for stability hasn't been susceptible to revision over time in response to changes or discoveries that we've made in science. But so say we have that framework as it stands now in the DSM, it's still interrelated reliability, and now we want to bring in patient narratives. But it's not clear that all these patients, and this goes to the hypo-narrative story, that they're all using the same conceptual frameworks to understand how it is that they're experiencing what they're experiencing. And so how do you get stable phenomena from those kinds of narratives that can then feed into these categories? So I guess my question is, what is it that we're after in these narratives? Is it going to be a complement to the DSM, or is it going to result in changes to the categories themselves? Or how do you see these narratives functioning when we might have to address this problem of kind of instability among, and it also relates to the looping effects problem.
That's a great question. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. When this whole thing started, like when there was a shift from the more psychoanalytic framework to operational framework, in a way, they kind of came up with these categories with the caveat that these are far from perfect. These are not the ideal like descriptions of mental disorders, but we'll just start here and then kind of fill in the blanks as we like go along. But then somehow along the way, those categories got reified like that, like they became like really, really inflexible. And I think that's when the gaps between what patients are experiencing and telling and the diagnostic categories started to emerge. Like even something like the grief, right? Grief was initially not considered a pathological or a kind of depression because there was a genuine external cause for someone's grief, and they introduced like some temporal criteria for at what point you can diagnose someone grieving with depression, and then like in the latest DSM that got eliminated. So so that creates like the kind of construct instability problem. But what ended up happening, I think, is in its attempt to kind of make these like certain maybe stable criteria, DSM omitted so much detail from the characterization, from the experience of mental disorder, that it kind of lost its descriptive capacity. So when you look at depression category, it's actually great. Like a lot of the things that are listed there are, it's true. Like, this is really what happens. But I think when patient's narrative or patient's perspective is missing from that, it's a little bit kind of there are lots of like empty parts that is not maybe as characterized, as thickly defined. So, I mean, in terms of like the positive proposal, this is something that I talked about. I think DSM is trying to be too many things at the same time, right? In that sense, I like the idea of separating the project of, describing or explaining mental disorders from maybe the project of intervening on mental disorders. Something like what I'm suggesting that includes patients' perspectives and so on, could be maybe a DSM equivalent of a clinical paradigm of some sort where we use those changes to do that. And RDoc can be the kind of neuroscience genetics component of this kind of research. And even in the RDoc, they have a self-report category. So I guess, anyway, so I'm kind of like, I think shifting back and forth. But like short answer is, I don't think that this is just a competition to DSM. It's a complementary. I think this would ideally make the DSM categories better fit for clinical purposes and clinical interventions. I'm not really quite sure about the how these would feed into neuroscientific or genetic research, but for the clinical purposes, I think this would be an important project. But I think DSM also largely should stop trying to do everything all at once, because we can use pluralistic methods to do different goals, and in that, depending on the our purpose, we can fix a construct, right? It depends on what we are aiming to do. Something like in the clinical context, like self is so important, that should be central, but somebody might say that necessarily don't need to be central in the kind of research on the brain, but it might, so.
Okay. So, I like this project of kind of applying feminist epistemology to the psychiatric research and using that as a way to preserve a kind of proper kind of objectivity that gives us generalized knowledge, but in a understanding of the context. But you might think that's just a whole different project that might dovetail here, or maybe it's intention. So you mentioned a few times the kind of personalized medicine aspect, and there it seems like the goal is not general knowledge, right? The goal is specific, very specific knowledge. And I guess you want different kinds of methods and different kinds of evidence and different kinds of approaches for that. Are these intention, or are these complementary?
Like the person.
The drive for generalized knowledge and the drive for personalized knowledge.
That's a good question. I don't think I've thought of it that way. I think I was thinking of like generalized knowledge to be like, to arrive at generalized knowledge, we need to have like kind of personalized, like person-based knowledge. But I really like the idea of kind of aligning this kind of project with more like person-centered medicine. Something that really interesting happened in the last 5 years. People were talking about person-centered medicine, and that evolved into precision medicine. I don't know if anyone else noticed that language. That was primarily because person-centered medicine, the intention was to identify people's like genes and see what kind of medications or drugs they might be like better responsive to and so on. So in a way, it was kind of actually moving away from a more like holistic concept of personhood, like to more reductionistic way. But I like the idea of kind of framing some of this in like person-centered medicine way, where in person aspect of wholeness, like the holistic approach is preserved. Great.
I'm wondering about your conclusion that patient testimony is indispensable.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you have so many convincing practical reasons why that's true. I'm wondering if maybe there's also a conceptual argument for that conclusion, depending on what you think the subject matter of psychiatry is. Right? So, in some sense, we might understand psychiatry as making generalizations about particular subjective experiences, right? So, in that sense, psychiatry is offering you like a view from nowhere, but about the view from somewhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the actual subject matter of psychiatry is subjective experience. I mean, this was certainly more true when it was the psychoanalytic, and then that dropped off during the behavioral period, but we're not doing behaviors anymore. So in a sense, really, psychiatry is, again, about subjective experience, right? So even when it succeeds at this objective, generalizing level, where you get a view from nowhere, it's giving you conclusions about subjective experience, right? And in that sense, really, you can't get a better, it's not,
that.
Right, it's not clear that the general perspective on that's going to actually be better than a whole pile of particular perspectives on that.
That's a great way to frame it. I guess, again, so when you look at the symptom language in the DSM, it is really all about patient experience, and that's what's kind of appalling, that suddenly patient perspective is subjective and doesn't have a place in science, but that's actually what it's been all the way. And that's why I use the language of third person perspective, because in the DSM talks about signs and symptoms. Signs experienced by the patient, symptoms experienced by the patients, signs observed by others. So being observed by others is a huge, takes a huge place in psychiatric epistemology, and I think that has some, partially to do with not necessarily trusting the patient and what they're saying. So you need this kind of external pair of eyes. But in lots of ways, of course, it's obvious to, I've been thinking about how I started working on this topic. I was interested in mental illness. I was first year PhD student. I'm like, I'm just gonna go read some memoirs of people with mental illness. And that was such a natural place for me to start doing research. And I realized afterwards that wasn't actually the way in which a lot of scientific work on the subject matter kind of continued. But I guess we can maybe take that as what you suggested as these collections of particulars about this one thing as a starting point, and kind of bring in patients at that point.
Yeah, when they get it right from the objective generalizing standpoint, they can account for the memoir.
Yeah.
Right? That's the standard. That's the goal. Right?
Yeah.
Is to make sense of the subjective particular experience.
And that's precisely the thing worries me, because it has to, and I think it puts the subjective or the testimony at a higher standard. Right? Right now, we don't really know a lot about women's bodies, because we haven't started really doing research on them until 1990s. We don't know a lot about perimenopause. We don't know a lot about, we know more about infertility than perimenopause, because we're almost actually bearing children, and we know what's happening in the United States right now. It's not really kind of surprising, but I think by like negating like this anomalous information, maybe somebody else at some point in time will have a similar experience, but just because it wasn't confirmed by science, it didn't make it its way to our understanding. And that really worries me, what gets lost in kind of our striving for this like generalizable phenomena. So I think in that sense, I mean, withstanding their limitations, memoirs or testimonies are good places because you find something that, you know, has maybe a grain of truth.
So I want to come back to, there was a part of Jackie's question that I was intrigued by about the looping effects. So if you think about some of the ways you're presenting the value of videographic knowledge is that it's a kind of authentic reflection of somebody who has the experience of that condition. But that's always going to be filtered through whatever cultural categories we use to describe our mental lives. And so, I mean, there must be ways of getting around this. I assume in psychological experiments, you have ways of getting knowledge from somebody's experience and trying to filter out all the ways that they might, you know, their own categorizations and their own thinking about it might actually be an obstacle to revealing what it is they're experiencing. But that just seems like a huge issue here.
It is a huge issue, actually, yeah. That's what I ended up writing my dissertation on in some regard, because I was like, oh, there's no escape from it. Some of these memoirs are written by psychoanalytic with psychoanalytic language. Some of them are now, like, it's actually very interesting. A lot of neuron talk. A lot of like, my brain is crazy and my brain is hijacked kind of talk coming out in memoirs, whereas like 10 years ago, it wasn't really there. And like 50 years ago, it was really not there. So when in one of my papers, I kind of compare John Stuart Mill's depression story with a more actually, I don't think I published that, but it's somewhere in the dissertation, to juxtapose like different approaches, different languages. And that's a huge problem, because it's not, I think, just like important like from a like metaphysical or epistemic standpoint, but it's also important from an ethical standpoint, because some of these ways of thinking about ourselves is not conducive to our flourishing. Like, you know, thinking that my brain is like hijacked, it will never recover, is a horrible way of responding to your mental illness, because then you're like, well, I can't do anything about it. And again, like, we don't really know how much of that is actually accurate information. So I call this kind of like the DSM culture, or like just kind of culture of like these different kinds of paradigms in a way. And that's a big problem in testimonies. Like, not all memoirs are like same quality or same detailed, thick description. What's really interesting is there's a law professor, Ellen Sachs. She has a book called Center Can't Hold, where she writes her experience with schizophrenia. And she's trained as a philosopher too, so she's a wonderful writer. But she talks about how her treatment changed, like from when psychoanalysis was dominant. She had a psychoanalyst in England, and now she was diagnosed, like, again, in California with the DSM criteria, and she kind of compares those two. But this is very high level capacity. A lot of patients don't really have that kind of framework. A friend of mine and I are actually thinking of kind of starting this website about like what we know, what we don't know, and what are these kind of like narratives about like mental disorders, because that seems to be important, because so much gets lost in like media and the incomplete information that in a way harms, I think, people who are, you know, suffering from this condition. But that's a huge problem. Yeah.
Just on that, I wonder if thinking about looping effects and being worried about them is maybe not the way to think about that. Because, and I'm just thinking, this is anecdotal, but I'm thinking, have you read, I think it's called Marking the Mind or Naming the Mind?
No.
Kurt Zondervan's The History of Psychology. Really interesting. Anyway, the first chapter, he recounts having gone as a visiting professor to China in the psychology department there, and wanting to co-teach a class with one psychologist there. That'd be fun. And they never were able to do it because they couldn't agree on what they were studying. The language of the Chinese psychologist was very, very different from his. Danziger's a Canadian, I think. Right? So these things were very different, and they couldn't actually even really talk with one another because their subject matter was so different. And by the way, I think this is not coincidental in the sense that it just turns out historically all the mental clinics in China, maybe not all, that's probably an exaggeration, but many of the mental clinics in China are run out of Buddhist monasteries. And so that the Buddhist influence has changed the way they think about mental illness and how to treat it. But anyway, that's the sort of the background. The question is, maybe mental disorders are different in China than they are here. And so the looping effects aren't getting us away from objectivity, right? They're helping us define the illness in its cultural and social context.
That's a good point. So the way, I mean, who knows what Hacking actually meant when he was writing looping effects, because there's no consistent way in which he characterizes it. Like sometimes, you know, looping effects are like affecting people's self-concepts, sometimes, or, you know, diagnosis affects people's self-concepts or sometimes their behavior. And he's not really consistent about this. And the way I kind of got out of it was, I think maybe as a philosopher of science, he was coming at it from a kind of scientific classification of how it affects people, and then how that in turn affects scientific classification's perspective. But as someone, you know, this philosophy of mind as well, I think it's pertinent to think about that as a, you know, property of selves, like property of human mind to be actually reflective and, you know, responsive to the ways in which we are conceptualized out there in the world. So in that sense, like if we kind of think about like the, you know, person or the self as the core phenomenon, and where like mental disorder is the kind of, you know, a property of maybe that's like central self, then kind of things shift. So we, in the China context, of course, you know, I'm sure Chinese also get influenced by the way in which they're perhaps being talked about and so on. And that might create like a framework for mental disorders that might actually be quite similar to the kind of North American context. But I think it's important to kind of think about those properties of looping effects as just like a given and of the property of our, you know, capacities as human selves, as human subjects. We're cognitive, we're reflective, we're aware, we think about things, and then we then think about the way we think about things and so on. So, yeah, but.
Yeah, and the world nowadays is pretty small, so you can have access to different ways of conceptualizing your own, you know, and so, I mean, that seems to me to suggest that there could, for any given set of individuals, there could be a number of ways across those individuals. And I don't know, how do we get at, are they all depressed, or what is it exactly, you know, how do we even sort of group them together? But if they have different ways of conceptualizing themselves, then how do we make sense of that kind of data for the purposes that you want to put it to? And I guess that's my worry. Like I'm sympathetic to the idea that we need to have something stable that we're looking at. Not that anything's ever stable, but that scientists would really like things, or clinicians want things to have some degree of stability so they can use them for certain purposes. But with respect to this, yeah, I mean, I find this really interesting, and I really enjoyed the talk a lot, and it's got me thinking of all these
You know,
things.
that's a huge problem. I mean, there is a lot of now interesting work coming out about, you know, how eating disorders was not a thing in Japan, and now a lot of young schoolgirls in Japan are suffering from eating disorders. And there's this kind of, again, I think by the virtue of the fact that we are cognitive, reflective beings, we do respond to phenomena out there in like adaptive or like maladaptive ways. I guess, like, I mean, but the problem of, I think, stability of the construct and how including patients might disrupt it, I don't think that's a bigger problem than the already existing, like, construct stabilization problems. You know what I mean?
Just to be clear, I'm not worried about the stability.
Okay.
I mean, maybe that would be impact. I'm just worried about how you get clear on what all these people are sharing in common if they have different accounts of what it is that they're experiencing. Like, is there some kind of stable across?
Yeah, sorry. Okay. Yeah. No, I think that's actually precisely what we get, because so there's a lot of work that's being done, for instance, on schizophrenia recovery. It's contentious, but some sociologists argue that schizophrenia recovery rates are higher in developing countries than in developed countries. And they kind of analyze this in like 5 axes, like things like having a regular employment, regular job, feeling like you belong to a community and so on, in their view, is helping people in developing countries to kind of almost recover from schizophrenia, whereas in the kind of Western society context, we further isolate people with mental illness, right? Like they get disability and they no longer have to work and they're kind of pushed out of the community in a way, which, these sociologists think that seemed to kind of contribute. One thing that a colleague and I did was we did a kind of meta-analysis of various memoirs in these 5 axes. And these are all kind of memoirs of success and recovery, right? So we have actually a kind of good piece of data in our hands, what they think will help them flourish or survive withstanding their illnesses. And they too actually talked a lot about having a great community of supporters, having meaningful work to go to. So there seems to be these trends that people kind of authentically, find or whatever, that either they're experiencing or they're finding that helps. Again, there's a huge users movement that started in Netherlands and now is spread around everywhere, Hearing Voices Network. These are a group of patients basically that get together and they talk about their experiences. Nothing really gets solved or resolved, but at least they have some kind of community where they no longer feel like they're alone in their heads being talked to, but they can share their experiences and stuff. And those are the kinds of success stories in a way that makes me kind of optimistic. We might be, we might find some of the generalizable stories based on these particular stories coming from, but also more kind of, anecdotal, rare things that we might use later. Okay.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right, let's thank our speakers.
Thank you so much.